Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for MITRE's first panel focusing on human rights violations in Iran. I'm Sahar Sadeghian. I am Iranian American and have been at MITRE for the past 12 and a half years. Please make sure that you mute yourself during this panel and put any questions that you have in the box. I would like to thank our Women's Business Resource Group, also called our Women's Council here at MITRE, for hosting this event. Also, a huge thank you to Katie Warren, who is the chair of our Women's Council and who helped me put this event together. Also like to thank Deanna Stanley, who's also part of the Women's Council leadership team, for doing all the comms and logistics and for running the meeting for us today. For those that don't know, the Women's Council of MITRE have been tremendous advocates for encouraging and promoting women both in and out of MITRE. One of their main focuses is promoting change through understanding, which is precisely what we're doing here today. So I'm very thankful to be in this environment and to have this type of support to show solidarity with the women of Iran, with the people of Iran, and to promote awareness. The events that have happened these last few months have been really devastating and very difficult to watch and have weighed very heavily for many of us. About a month ago, I was feeling that weight and I had no outlet. So I reached out to our CEO, Jason Provodakis, and his team. And I asked them for an outlet, for a means of bringing awareness to our MITRE community and perhaps beyond, and to have MITRE stand on the side of the great Iranian people who are so courageous and fighting for their basic human rights, fighting for their right to just have a normal life. And that discussion evolved and became this panel. As you may have also seen, Jason also signed a letter to the United Nations to petition the United Nations to remove Iran from the UN Commission of Women. And he posted that, or his team posted that in the article that has been on the MII the last few days. So again, I'm very thankful to be part of such a supportive environment where our company, our CEO, our staff are all finding a way to show solidarity. Today, we are very fortunate to have a panel of a tremendous panel of experts with decades of experience working in human rights, working for Iran, for the Iranian people. And I'm so thankful that they've taken time out of what you can just imagine is a crazy hectic schedule right now to talk to us, to talk to our staff, to answer our questions. So can we go to the next slide, Deanna, please? So I will introduce them, but I will let them give you their own background because they are extensive and very incredible people. We'll start with Ms. Azadeh Pourzand. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Sahar, and all of your colleagues. It's a great opportunity to be able to, speak to what I consider, for us, I would say, an unusual crowd, and to also engage in a conversation. I'm personally very curious about some of the questions that you and your colleagues may have, and look forward to an inclusive conversation on it. Just very briefly, my background is in human rights research and UN and international level advocacy on human rights. I have a sort of a small growing human rights organization named after my father, who was a journalist and who was in jail for his beliefs in Iran, named Pourzand Foundation, where we promote freedom of expression for Iranian marginalized groups who basically want to have their own voice in the human rights discussion rather than others advocating for their rights exclusively without them. I guess I leave it at this. I guess another thing that maybe is appropriate for today's discussion is that I'm doing my PhD research focused on, Iranian women's activism in post-revolutionary Iran. So it's been a difficult time because there are so many patterns that are repeating themselves and each other, just on a very different scale. And I'm happy to address that as well. It's difficult to be in a panel with such an esteemed person like Hadi, who I think knows it all, but I'll try not to be intimidated and to contribute to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Azadeh. We'll also go to Mr. Hadi Ghaemi. Thank you so much for being with us today from the Center for Human Rights in Iran, or CHRI. Could you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Hello, Saharjan and your colleagues. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who organized and invited us during these critical times to inform you and give you as much information as we have about what is happening in Iran, which is very troubling. Before I introduce myself, I just want to add to Azadeh Jan's her own introduction. She also did not mention her mother, Mehrangiz Kar, who is a pioneering women's rights advocate and lawyer, who really what we're seeing today is due to the efforts that she began in the late 80s and early 90s. She is really a very significant pioneer of women's rights in Iran. And I would just say Azadeh has grown up in the depth of the women's rights movement all these years. So she's very, very well connected to that movement. Now about myself, I'm an Iranian American. I was born in Iran and came here at the age of 16 to pursue my higher education. My first life actually was life of an academic. I'm a physics professor by profession and did my work in experimental nanophysics, which, since we have a lot of engineers in the audience, I imagine I have some technical background. I stopped doing academic work. I was a professor of physics circa 2000, 2001. When I started focusing on Iran, and especially the human rights angle at the time in 2000 was very clear to me, will be the engine of change in Iran, as we're seeing today. So I joined Human Rights Watch originally for a few years, and then in 2008 founded the Center for Human Rights in Iran. So for nearly 20 years, I'm following the events inside Iran day in, day out, our organization researching, documenting, and doing a lot of advocacy with governments and UNs. Many of the results you're seeing, such as last week in Geneva, the Human Rights Council established a very important fact-finding mission. This week, we hope that Iran will be kicked out of the Commission on the Status of Women. The Biden administration policies have somewhat turned from their focus on the nuclear issue, and I would say our organization has been very impactful in keeping discussions, debates, and recommendations with them for the past 2 years they've been in power. So we work on many fronts, and today, of course, we're seeing with the events in Iran that work is more essential than any other time.
Thank you so much, Hadi. Before we dive into all that, we were also supposed to have Gissou here with us. Unfortunately, she got called into an urgent meeting with some of the ambassadors at the United Nations, talking about precisely what Hadi just mentioned about taking Iran off of the Women's Commission. She was kind enough to send us a video, just a short video going over what she's doing, but Deanna will play that for you once we get into the depth of our United Nations discussion. So we have a lot of people on the phone, almost 600 people listening in. Again, please make sure that you're on mute, everybody. But for those in the audience, I know a lot has happened. Just events have been kind of going on exponentially, but just to take it back a little bit, for those in the audience that may be unfamiliar with kind of what's been happening these last 3 months, Hadi, could you give us an overview of just what started all this, what sparked this moment in September?
Well, it's really significant to say that the events beginning with the death of Mahsa Jina Amini on September 16 of this year did not come out of nowhere. There were a lot of background that I hope we can talk about. But in terms of the specific events, basically, Mahsa Jina Amini was a Kurdish young woman, 22-year-old. It was late summer. She was traveling on a summer vacation with her family to capital Tehran. She's in the metro with her brother. They come out of the station, and for some reason, which could not have only had to do with her hijab, because we've seen videos of her quite well covered for Iranian standards even. She gets picked up arbitrarily, and that's the key, that there were these morality police on the streets for decades harassing women and subjugating them on a purely arbitrary whim of the individual agents. Mahsa Jina fell into one of these arbitrary acts of vengeance, I would say, where she is asked to go into a van, be taken to a police station. Her brother tries to dissuade them, find out why would they do that. Her hijab looks fine. They don't care. It becomes a violent confrontation. And from women who were in the van with her, we know that she suffered blows to her head. She's taken to a police station where the government released videos of her in a waiting room with dozens of other women. She's not feeling well. She goes up to the person in charge, and within minutes she collapses. And the next thing we know, she is in a coma in a hospital, and pictures of her coming out showing pretty much what appears to be a concussion to her head, because you have bleeding from the ear and the nose and bandages there. And she dies within 48 hours. As the news comes out, as her pictures and coma go viral, it really touched a nerve that has to do with what the country has been experiencing for the past 5 years, especially. Of course, we can go all the way back 44 years. But specifically, when there's time, I want to tell you what has been happening for the past 5 years, such that many, many Iranians felt they could not keep silent at this murder in the hand of government agents. And they started coming out and started literally first a protest movement that very rapidly grassroots escalated, became nationwide, pretty much 150 towns, with no organization, no leadership. Truly a national sense of resistance emerged, which today I would describe as a revolutionary movement, questioning the entire Islamic Republic and wanting to dislocate it and bring in a new era. That's in a nutshell. And of course, there's a lot of details we can go into, including at least 450 people who have been killed at the hands of the government agents, including over 60 children. I personally believe, based on my 2 decades of experience, the numbers are at least double of that, because I know of a dozen cases where the families have been threatened not to publicize the death of their loved ones. So this has been a very violent response by the state, and yet every day we have protests going on, and there is no sign of it abating or calming down.
Yes, that was one of my questions. Just to clarify, was that this did not start in September. The roots for these events are much deeper. So, Azadeh, can you tell us a little bit about, what Hadi kind of started, but what kind of brought us to this point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Hadi gave such a thorough overview, and I will focus on the history of both the protest movements in post-revolutionary Iran, and to show continuity in a way, and also a little bit about the women's rights movement, which also I think is evident in terms of continuity when we talk about it. And then I think it would be important to go back to Hadi and talk about these 5 years in particular because of certain policies. But one of the things that engaging with, like, especially Western media in the past couple of months, I have realized perhaps we haven't done a good job, it seems, conveying it to the world that the Iranian women and the Iranian people haven't just woken up on September 16th, realizing that they are repressed. And I personally try all the time to use any opportunity to talk about a history of dissent, of resistance that, if you look at every single marginalized groups, you see the threads of that history, but also on a nationwide. When you look at the protest movements alone, I think one of the most well-known protests in the world is the November 2019 nationwide protest, which was essentially, before this one of the largest nationwide protests we had. Personally, I remember I would wake up and read the news about cities and towns I had never heard their name before. And so it was quite humbling, even for those of us following Iran, having born and raised in Iran, to see people rising from such small towns in the peripheries and all of that. That protest sort of was ignited by the rising prices of gas, but also was highly political in its demands of, anti-government demands, essentially. Was heavily repressed. You see a lot of the patterns of repression of today sort of rooted in the November 2019 protest. It was really, sadly, a practice on that level, on that scale for the Islamic Republic to be prepared in a way to crack down on nationwide protests. Before that, we had the December 2017, 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Protest that also had something to do with an economic, reason. It was a budget of the government leaking. And also, again, it was in a way nationwide. It was cracked down upon, it was yet another example of marginalized groups, the working class coming to the streets. So I would say, in particular, these two protest movements were very much, led by the marginalized groups, the working class, but we weren't really seeing the middle class so much in the street. On November, for example, the internet was shut down, and I personally know some of my friends who are just annoyed that the internet is shut down and they wanted to get by their lives. Businesses, because of that, were affected and all of that. So there was still a bit of a divide, like you wouldn't see, your more educated or affluent groups on the street. In 2009, again, also pretty well known in the world, the Green Movement. It was about people disputing the results of a fraudulent election, which all elections in post-revolution Iran are fraudulent, but in that particular one, it led people on the street. It led to people being killed, such as a woman named Neda Agha Sultan, who became very famous, whose death was essentially viewed on camera by everyone. That movement was more capital-based, urban-based, and was more led by the middle class, but we weren't seeing enough of the less affluent classes of the society. We can go on about the previous uprisings, but I feel like what we see today is sort of in a way, a perfect epilogue to these kinds of protests that one has led to the other in terms of the continuity, but also because of the horrible policies and the cruelty of the Islamic Republic. But it's also a moment of coalescence of the different groups of the society. You see the cultural class, you see the professors, you see the artists, you see the university students, you see the pupils, school kids. Obviously women are at the forefront of this. You see the ethnic groups, the minority groups, and so on. So I think in a way, I always describe it as the nightmare of the Islamic Republic, because they wanted to always rule by dividing the country. Their hope was, at least when people become aware of their rights, they would advocate for just their own rights. And this is very dangerous and threatening to them, that they are now advocating for each other's rights. And I don't want to take too much of the time, but when it comes, I am happy to talk about the women's rights movement as well.
Excellent. So you touched on it definitely on when you said, you know, these elections are fraudulent, which is obviously 100% true. But it kind of leads me into talking about what are these violations that are currently going on in Iran. I mean, they're at the core of what's fueling the rage in people, and some of our audience might not even know, you know, some of these inequalities for women and some of these violations that are happening. So could you give us a again, let's keep this as a conversation, so either one of you who would like to jump in, go ahead, but could you guys give us an overview of what these inequalities are, because it's definitely not just a mandatory hijab.
Okay, let me take that, give a break to my co-panelists. I think to understand this, as we mentioned, they did not come out of nowhere. Actually, I was expecting this level of national protest to appear way back in January 2020, as I will explain why. And it was really the pandemic that postponed it. And now we're seeing it. To understand the situation, let me just mention that since 2015, a new word appeared in the political vocabulary of analysts, academics, and observers of Iranian affairs inside the country, something the international community, particularly the experts in Washington and Europe, completely missed because they were only focused on the nuclear issue. That word is in Farsi furupashi, which literally means implosion, collapse, or meltdown. And it started to refer to every part of social, economic, political fabric of the country. Political implosion or collapse came after the elections started to become completely irrelevant when they started to disqualify even their very own people who had been part of the regime. The circle of political holders of office started to shrink to a very hardcore fundamentalist group of people who took over the parliament, took over the presidency, and they are all connected to the Revolutionary Guards. Basically, Revolutionary Guards started to destroy the social, economic, political fabric of society. It took over politics, therefore people had no illusion of representation. They literally could not look at any elected office and believe that any of them representing them. Then, as importantly, is the economic collapse that has been underway. Iran is the only country in the world that for 4 decades suffering from double-digit inflation. And the economic collapse accelerated after 2015-16, even though after the nuclear deal, the sanctions were lifted. But the economic collapse continued because of corruption and pillage of the public treasury. People started waking up every day to financial scandals involving hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars being siphoned off by people connected to Revolutionary Guards who own much of the private public sector. So people at the same time were falling. 70% of country has fallen to poverty line or below. So that is where the middle class and working class started to find a lot of common grounds. Economically, they cannot put literally bread and butter on their table, have employment, or have any security for the future. But much more important is the social collapse, because repression has been going on against everyone, especially dissidents and people who don't agree with government for 44 years. But it also been targeting women and subjugation of women as a way to show the power of the state on the streets through the morality police. So women have been subject to discriminatory laws for 44 years, which means they're literally counted as second-class citizens. They're counted as half of men on every financial, legal, administrative front. And they don't have any power over their bodies or their lives without permissions of their male guardians. And I'm sure Azadeh will go into those discriminatory laws. But when they started beating them up and subjugating them even more in public, like Mahsa, That is when every Iranian woman could relate to Mahsa. Every Iranian family could relate because their mothers, daughters, sisters, they all had experienced similar public humiliation and detention. So every social fabric had collapsed. The state had completely decoupled itself from society, meaning no one could see any government actions being in their interest, but only in the interest of the power holders. And as importantly is the legal collapse, or the collapse of the legal system. We really haven't had any sense of justice in Iran. It had inflamed a sense of crisis of impunity, meaning that no one is ever held accountable from the lowest level, rank and file, to the highest level, the leader, for the crimes they were committing or directing their forces to commit. We can go back many, many decades, but for the young people on the street, their current memory begins with November 2019, when you have nearly 1,500 people potentially killed on the streets, with the internet shut down, and no one takes responsibility. Many of these people were innocent bystanders. Their families tried to go to judiciary and say, we need an investigation. Who did all these killings? Nothing happens. 2 months later, January 2020, a passenger airplane is shot down by the Revolutionary Guard's missiles, killing 180 people, all innocent. Again, no investigation, no accountability, complete sense of impunity. And the families cannot get any answers. Revolutionary Guards again involved, and no apologies. So that goes on to pandemic, when they start to ban vaccines, and during the 9 months to a year when the rest of the world had access to vaccines, Iranians cannot get it. Even though there are many offers of free vaccines to be donated, they would not take them because they control the pharma industry in Iran, and they thought their own vaccines will make them a killing if people wait for it. Which of course never came out, and hundreds of thousands of people perished without any completely preventable deaths. Again, people tried to ask for an investigation, who is responsible, nothing happens, crisis of impunity. So when Mahsa is killed, and they're not even willing to say who were those two agents who detained her, what did they do to her, put them onto a public accountability, a judicial process, nothing. They claim she died of natural death. And that was really what blew the top of the society. The crisis of impunity reached its limit. So we should understand that people are asking for a revolution because they feel like all social, economic, political, and judicial fabric of society has come apart, and there's a complete meltdown. And as they look into their future, they want a better future, and they realize Islamic Republic will never deliver. That's why we're seeing such a anger on the streets. And of course, about violations, they've been killing them. They've been killed over 450 people, detained 18,000 people. There's torture, rape, malnutrition, all kind of ill treatment against thousands of people in jails right now. And all of that is meant to put an end to protest, but instead they're inflaming them, and anger across the society, across the nation is palpable. So people have started a revolutionary movement. Whether it will become a revolution or not, we have to see. But I think this is the end of the Islamic Republic as we know it.
Let's hope so. You touched on a couple of things. One is that yes, it's gone up exponentially because so many people, it resonates with so many people. Just within our MITRE community, I reached out and asked if any of our people with Iranian heritage had any stories about their interactions with the morality police, and everybody, you either have yourself or you know of someone who has. So there isn't, I don't think there are any Iranians that are unaffected. For our MITRE audience, I also captured a lot of those. I'm not going to get through them in this panel, but I'll post them on our Fast Jump Iran, so you guys can take a look at. Just, they're anonymous, but just, your daily coworkers have all anybody with an Iranian background has gone through this. So that's that's definitely one thing. Azadeh, do you have anything you'd like to expand with just, you know, these inequalities for women and that movement?
Yeah, I mean, I can, again, Hadi did such a great job painting the picture as it is. What I guess I would just add to, I would just try to give a little bit more depth on the layers of discriminations that women and also some of the other marginalized groups or discriminated against groups experience in Iran. But I think before jumping into that and theorizing it, I just really want to say that I think the easiest way is imagining our lives as it is here, wherever we are in the free world, and just thinking that the people of Iran are dying to have that life. Like your typical Tuesday is what people are dying for in Iran. And I think that's, for me, that's always brings it back to like the heroicness of it all, but the ordinariness of what the people really want. They don't really want any kind of ism or any particular form of a government, or they just want to live their life, like as simple as this, and they haven't been able to. And like Hadi was explaining it, you know, for families like mine, it was always difficult. We were always the target of persecutions. You know, I grew up with so many people around me being executed because of their belief or jailed, or, you know, I grew up outside of prisons trying to get visitation to my parents and so on. But this was, you know, when we were growing up, this was still if you were targeted because of what you were doing as an activist, as a human rights lawyer, as a journalist, or if you were part of the discriminated against groups. But it wasn't, I don't think it was felt in this depth by the nation in its entirety in this layered manner that we see today. When we look at the women's situation, legally speaking, again, if you look at the cycle of from a little girl to you become a full-fledged woman, you see discrimination along the way. If you as a child you get caught in the middle of some kind of a crime, you know, like a girl is considered an adult at a much earlier age than a boy, which is anyways for a boy it should also be 18, and it's in some parts of the penal code it's not. We have the question of child marriage, which, you know, a lot of girl children from the less affluent and the more remote part of the country are victims of. You know, when the government claims that they have they have reformed the law, it's far from adequate in order to really protect these children. I give you, for example, they increased the age of child marriage from 9 to, let's say, 13 or something. But then, you know, if the guardians consent, like this girl or this boy, they can still get married at an earlier age. So, you know, we saw as the economic situation got worse, also we saw an increasing rate of like very little girls getting married to men 30 years older than themselves. So that's, as a child, you see that. As you know, as a school child, you have to start wearing this, you know, the scarf from the age 7 when you go to school. So you already are exposed to that level of discrimination, that you're different from the boys. And, you know, you study hard, you go to school, university. I mean, over 60% of women have higher education in Iran. But even there, you find a lot of discriminatory policies against you for the mandatory veil, for the way you walk, for the way you talk, you know, for some of the engineering, for example, degrees that you cannot study as a girl. And then, you know, if you fall in love, God forbid, if somebody sees you holding hands with somebody you're dating, that's considered a crime. You know, if you have premarital sex, that's considered a crime. If you know, so it goes on and on. Then you know, many people get married, although actually the rate of getting marriage has become like less because of all the socioeconomic and legal problems that people have become aware of. In marriage, you're essentially like, you have the man has absolute rights to divorce while you as a woman don't. They have custody of the child from a very young age. When as a woman you lose that custody. If you marry a second time, you immediately lose the custody over your children. You know, it goes on and on and on. And from what Hadi said, I grew up in a law office of a women's rights, a human rights lawyer, and she used to make me intern for her in the summers. And so I remember overhearing a lot of conversations with her clients. And back in the day, a lot of the women, I remember I was, even as a child, surprised that a lot of the women who would come to her office, even when they were very educated, they weren't really aware of the fact that they don't have these rights. And I think this awareness has really come with the different generations that have lived under this essentially tyrannic regime and the discriminations. So I think one of the things that I would say has had a role in what we see today is this gradual awareness of the different generations of women, of different minority groups, about the rights that they don't have. Because before you could really, I don't know how it was, but it was a lot of the segments of the society, especially if they were a little more affluent, they were living sort of in this blissful ignorance about what they don't have. And I think that's part of what we see today. And that's also why this is not about women's rights alone. This is not about the mandatory veil alone. It was sparked by that. It was led by the people who were the most discriminated against. But it's about much bigger than that, because none of those problems the Islamic Republic has proven cannot be solved without its larger repressive machine going away.
Let's take a quick look at, Deanna, if you could share the protest picture. Let's take a quick look at the protests that have been going on across the world and within DC, and touch on that before we dive into the UN stuff, because I know the audience wants to really hear about what initiatives are being taken place. Can you guys tell us a little bit about these protests that are, the first slide that we have is just from around the world. There's France, Italy, and Germany. If you on the left that you see is the flight that Hadi mentioned. It's flight 752. They kind of it's over 100,000 people in Berlin that gathered and kind of formed the shape of that flight. So could you tell us what impact these protests have had and how they're affecting the movement in Iran?
Yeah, what you should know is about this flight that was brought down in January 2020 by Revolutionary Guards. There is an Iranian American named Hamid Ismailian who lost his wife and daughter. He lives in Toronto. The family shuttled back and forth between Iran and Toronto, and when he lost his wife and child, he became an advocate for accountability for the past 2 years. Then when this protest happened, he was in a perfect position to capture the imagination of Iranian diaspora and bring them together. So he called for international protests, first in Toronto, then all over the world. In Toronto, he managed to bring out 50,000 people, Iranians and non-Iranians, that were by all accounts the largest protest in Toronto's history, political protests. That made the Canadian government to focus on the protests in Iran. Then in Berlin, 100,000 people came out when he organized it. And he really been the force to bring the diaspora around the same united focus in supporting the Iranian people inside the country. The ramification of that has particularly been to wake up Europe and Canada and United States about how important it is to put away the nuclear issue and focus on domestic dynamics. So as a result, both Canada and Germany have become leaders on the international front in holding Iranian government accountable. And this sense of unity has given a lot of impetus and encouragement to people back in Iran that their compatriots are behind them. Because let's not forget, the Iranians in diaspora are not few. Iran is a country today of nearly 85 million people. 8 million of them at least live all around the world, from Australia to North America to Europe and all over. So this 10% of population living abroad is becoming a major force in determining international response to the crimes taking place in Iran.
Thank you. And we have some pictures from our own hometown here with protests in DC that have been going on every Saturday since that initial October 1st. Let's go ahead and jump onto some of the UN questions because we don't have too much time left. Diana, if you could go to the next slide and we can play Gissou's message from the UN.
Hi everyone, this is Gissou Nia. Sorry that I can't be there to speak to MITRE today. I hope I'm saying that right. I would have loved to be there, but I have come to New York because me and a group of Iranian women rights activists have come together to meet UN missions here in New York to discuss the upcoming special meeting of UN ECOSOC, that's the Economic and Social Council, that will happen on Wednesday, December 14th, where there is a resolution that's being tabled to remove the Islamic Republic of Iran off of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And so this week is really important. We're going to be meeting with a lot of missions to try to make sure that they vote yes to the removal. It's going to be by open ballot. So any country that votes no would officially be siding with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we want to make sure, siding with the IRI and siding against the women and girls of Iran. So we want to make sure that states understand this and that they make the right choice on Wednesday. So basically, there's a few strands of work that I've been involved in and that, a huge team of folks have been involved in over these past few weeks, basically since the protests, which are now being called the revolution, have started. And one was to establish a UN fact-finding mission, which was voted on in Geneva 2 weeks ago, and it was a successful vote. I know that my co-panelists here were super involved in that as well, Azadeh and Hadi was in Geneva with all of us when we were there. So that's fantastic that was set up. That was set up by the UN Human Rights Council. It was an amazing vote. 25 voted for, only 6 countries voted against. And again, we were doing advocacy with the missions there to ensure that they did the right thing. With that fact-finding mission, it actually feeds directly into the kind of work that I do because I focus a lot on accountability, putting together legal submissions to hold alleged perpetrators accountable. And what we're really in need of is a sort of international body that will collect, preserve, and analyze evidence at a certain level that could potentially meet a criminal burden of proof to sustain indictments. In any case, very excited about the work of the FFM. And now that that's established, there's a lot of work ahead to be done in terms of appointing independent experts. They're going to have 3 independent experts. That should happen before the end of the year. And then getting together a staff, which could be, I think, up to 18 people or possibly more. And that would include, gender, basically gender analysts, experts, investigators with specific OSINT experience, open source investigation experience. So very excited for that. What is happening on Wednesday, December 14th is the other UN campaign that we really need everybody's attention on, which is to remove the Islamic Republic of Iran off the Commission on the Status of Women. Just for some context, the Commission on the Status of Women is at the UN's top global body that sort of shapes the norms around women's empowerment, gender equality around the world. And it's absolutely shameful that The Islamic Republic is one of the 45 member states on that commission. They were elected in 2021. They began a 4-year term in March 2022, and we firmly believe that they need to be kicked off because they are proud of their gender discriminatory legal framework. If I was in Iran, I would not have the same rights to custody, inheritance, marriage, divorce as a man. I would be forced to dress, with a compulsory headscarf and loose-fitting clothing, even if I don't feel like doing that, and even if it's not my choice. I could be stoned for adultery. My testimony would be worth half that of a man in a courtroom. As a lawyer, that gets me particularly riled up. And there's so much else that's included in Iran's Islamic Penal Code and regulations that are discriminatory against women. So the Islamic Republic is really proud of this. They think that the place for a woman is in the home, in the domestic sphere, and they're just doubling down. And so they really are unfit to be on any kind of membership or leadership role, rather, on a commission on the status of women. So I hope that ECOSOC does indeed vote them off. I'll close there, but what I would say to the audience is that there's a lot of ways to get involved. So one is with the CSW vote, you can visit womenlifefreedom.today and sign an open letter that was signed by global women, like prominent women leaders all over the world, who are in favor of the IRI being removed from the CSW, and also contains a bunch of Iranian women signatories, including women inside Iran, who are really asking for this. So I would go and add your name there. And then the other thing is that you can reach out to your foreign ministries, prime ministers, presidents, if you're in any of the ECOSOC countries that have a vote. You can just Google online which countries are going to be voting, and just drop them a note and say that you want to see the Islamic Republic kicked off the Commission on the Status of Women. Anyhow, again, wish I could really be there with you all today, but thank you for being interested in this topic, and wish us luck next week.
So Gissou shared this. She's in New York right now, meeting with some of the ambassadors about the initiatives that are being taken. We've mentioned a couple of them during our discussion. One is the removal of Iran from the UN Women's Commission, which Jason signed and Hadi and Azadeh mentioned. And another is more about keeping Iran or doing an investigation in Iran, which I'll let our panel talk about. So Azadeh, could you tell us a little bit about this vote that's coming up to remove Iran from the UN Women's Commission and what that'll mean?
Yeah, I can talk about that, but I think probably it's also important to talk about the fact-finding mission, which I'm happy to very briefly talk about. So I think one thing that Hadi said that is key here is the waking up of some of the key Western countries in a more multilateral manner and concerted manner against what's happening by the Islamic Republic of Iran. I work on the secretariat of a coalition called Impact Iran, where we do lots of UN advocacy. And ever since the November 2019 protests that I told you about, organizations that work on human rights in Iran, such as also Hadi's organization, were demanding from the UN to hold the Islamic Republic accountable for the atrocities, and warning the UN that if you do not hold the regime accountable, it's going to continue, and it's going to continue on a bigger scale than the 1,500 being killed in November 2019. Unfortunately, we tried really hard, we advocated, and not much came out of it in terms of, at the very least, establishing some kind of an independent investigative mechanism to look into all these killings and detentions that were happening in November 2019. This time around, I think one of the good things was that the Iranian civil society abroad that does the UN advocacy actively was in a way prepared to reignite the ask for accountability, like Hadi said, an end to the culture of impunity, and referring the international community to, you see, if you had done this before, we may have, because a lot of the perpetrators of these violences that we see today are all the key figures of the Islamic Republics in 2019. A lot of the judges, it was kind of a stronger narrative. Plus, to be honest with you, women being at the forefront of this helped the discourse. It I think, resonated with the representatives of different member countries of the UN more than it did in November 2019. And I think it's an example of this unity that Hadi was talking about, on a more focused scale, that the unity of the civil society organizations, of the human rights community inside and outside the country, that I think really led to what I think is a victory, which is the establishment of the, essentially what is the first time UN independent fact-finding mission that will look into the atrocities of what, of just this movement, though, like from what happened from Mahsa Jina Amini's death in custody onward. This is critical because we have no other way of doing this kind of an independent investigation. It's challenging because you need very solid documentation pieces in terms of human rights documentations that will have to be submitted and reviewed by this mechanism. Also, what's important about it is that in the vote, there were more global South countries that voted yes to it than Western countries, which is very important because the Iranian regime always wants to say that these are all just Western scenarios. The US and Israel are behind it, to just, the kind of conspiracy theories. And I think it really was a hard day for them, because it really was more like the world was supporting the establishment of this fact-finding mission. On the CSW front,
sorry, before we move on from that, so what can we expect from this investigation? What's the timeline of it when they come back? What should we expect of, what's going to happen to
sure
Iran?
Hadi has a lot to say on that, so I will.
And Hadi, you were in Geneva for that vote, right?
Yeah. So let's understand why this independent investigation was needed. We are facing a very, very large number of crimes under international law being committed, especially against women, girls, young people, and ethnic minorities. I mentioned, I believe, nearly 1,000 people been killed, nearly 20,000 people been detained, tortured, prosecuted, potentially many could face execution. So the level of crime is very high. To document it in a way that a court could in the future prosecute it is not within anybody's ability. Definitely civil society doesn't have those resources, not large organizations like Amnesty International, and not smaller ones, Iran-focused like my own or Azadeh's organizations or anyone. For that, you need a dedicated group of experts to document and preserve evidence. The important thing about this mechanism is that it actually has a budget. It has a budget to employ as many as 20 people who are basically like a prosecutor and detective team. They are going to document and preserve evidence of these crimes within the next year for international and national courts that could in the future prosecute them. We already have seen in Sweden, Iranian intelligence officials have been prosecuted under a doctrine called universal jurisdiction. So it is not impossible to imagine that future prosecutions could take place, even in Iran itself. If there is regime change, if there is accountability for these crimes, we need to have preserved and collected this evidence to be able to move forward in a proper judicial and just way. And that is what this fact-finding mission will do, with a budget and 20 experts who are experienced on how to collect and preserve evidence of crimes. it will have an immediate impact inside the country, because now everyone from rank and file on the street doing the shooting, to the interrogator doing the torture, to the judge issuing the sentences, to the very top leader who is leading that entire collection of crimes, they will know that a judicial file, a prosecutorial file is being put together for their crimes. Therefore, I think it will also have an impact within the country psychologically when they know that experts are observing, documenting, and preparing judicial dossiers for prosecution and accountability.
So that leads me to a question that is from the audience about the reports that came out this weekend about the morality police is being abolished and the hijab is under review. And I think for us with Iranian heritage, we just saw it and kind of knew, oh great, here's another tactic. But some people unfortunately took that PR stunt very seriously. Could you tell us, what you make of those developments?
It absolutely was a PR stunt. Doesn't make any difference, because Iranian people have disbanded the morality police. There is no morality police on the streets anymore for 2.5 months. Instead, they're bringing every single body they can in their security forces, militias, including men who worked for morality police, and giving them a gun to control the protests. So morality police did not exist. And women have been violating the hijab rules in such a large numbers in public that it's pretty much impossible to roll it back. So I call it functionally irrelevant. There was no morality police to begin with to disband it. The law still is there. It discriminates against women. And this was absolutely a PR stunt, which no one in the country will take it seriously. And it was a way to deflate the air out of protests that were planned for today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. Wednesday is a very big day in Iran. Even under most peaceful times, university campuses will turn to huge political protests on this day. Wednesday, December 7th is called the National Student Day in commemoration of 3 university students who were killed on campus during a protest about 60 years ago. But for the past 60 years, both under the previous regime and this regime, it has been a moment of political protest. So naturally this year it has taken even an oversized significance. And this announcement on yesterday was trying to deflate the protest movement, but from talking to people inside Iran, no one really cares what they said, because people have pushed it away anyway, and instead they're facing a government who has declared war on its own population in the streets.
So it's important for our MITRE staff to take that very important takeaway. I guess it's something that we all kind of grew up with, and we take that as, with a grain of salt, because we know how many lies they have told, so we don't believe what comes out of the Islamic regime officials. But just a very important takeaway that you should be skeptical when you see something like that, and they are full of these PR stunts. How quickly our time is wrapping up. I wish we had more time with you guys, and if there's interest from MITRE, which there seems to be because we have hundreds of people on the phone, about diving into something more, specific things, please send me an email and let me know, and then hopefully we can have Hadi and Azadeh join us again. Azadeh, did you have any last thoughts before we start to wrap up?
Thank you so much. No, I just really want to say how impressed I am by the number of audiences. I keep seeing the number and it makes me very happy. Thank you so much for taking an interest in what is so close to our hearts, but I know a lot is happening in the world, and for your colleague Sahar to take some time from their busy day and listen to us. It means the world to me, and I really think it means the world to all those Iranians who are risking their lives. So thank you so much, and I really hope we can continue to have your support and solidarity.
Thank you so much, Azadeh, and thank you again for making time with everything going on to talk to us and to be here with us, and hopefully we can have you back in the future. Thank you again to the Women's Council for hosting this event and for helping the voices of the Iranian people, women, men, children be heard. As you see, we have a fast jump, just fast jump Iran. You can leave comments there. I know we were running short on time, but if you have questions, please leave them there for us, and or feel free to just ping me anytime. Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Hadi.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.